I'd like to let you all know that we are recording this for the purposes of our archives, but also to make sure that it's broadcast and available to many other people who might want to make reference to it, or who do not have the time right now and will be able to refer over time. So for that reason, please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off unless you're asking a question or a direct reference has been made to you. So I think sometime in late February, I think on the 24th of February this year, the Russian military invaded Ukraine. We at the Institute of Economic Affairs use the word invaded very deliberately because this was a violation of internationally recognized borders and an attack on the sovereignty of one country. So the task today is not necessarily to solve or to debate the politics of it, but basically to acknowledge the facts that are there, which is basically one country invaded another, violated United Nations norms of sovereignty and non-aggression towards other countries. The effect of that fight, which was, depending on who you look at, was expected to be short, has actually rippled throughout the economies, has had political consequences, but we in Kenya have felt both the political and economic consequences of that decision and an ongoing conflict. We are conscious that there's suffering on both sides because no conflict is usually, especially of this scale, speaks well of the human condition in the 21st century. And for that, we are sorry, but we do more than that. Our view is that perhaps this should be resolved as quickly as is possible, and we hope that that can happen, even if, of course, increasingly it looks like it might go on for a while. So we sit in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, for whom some significant suffering is taking place, and hope that this finds a resolution quickly through peace, and that there's opportunity for reconstruction. But that stated, we know that that invasion has had implications for Kenya and the region. And we also know that there's been discussions both within Kenya, the region, and globally about what the effects of this would be on many parts of the world. So the IEA's program on international trade and development, in which we track Kenya's commitments globally, multilaterally, and obviously regionally, is asking the question, with the benefit of about 7 weeks of consideration and looking at it, what are some of the immediate, the medium term, and the indirect effects of this conflict in Eastern Europe? And some of the things have been mentioned very, very clearly. As you'll see later, Kenya has very direct trade relations with both countries, both Ukraine and Russia. That's one of the reasons why Kenya stands as it is, but we think that the commercial interests might be one thing, but also the peace interests actually pervade and will be useful for everybody else. So my colleague, Emmanuel Wachendo, who's an assistant program officer in the IEA's Trade and Development Program, will make a presentation for half an hour, taking us through some insights, but also stating some facts about the trade between Kenya and Ukraine and Kenya and Russia, and what the implications would that be for Kenya itself, specific industries, but also go touch on East African and regional trade, for instance. And then thereafter, we will open up this opportunity for a conversation and a question and answer. But I'd like to let us know one thing. If you have any questions or any reactions that you have, please send your reactions through the chat box. Floating by is available on the menu. A floating menu is available on this facility. And you can ask questions directly, or any comments that you make. We'll try and make sure that their answers are made available. And after the half an hour, which I'll strictly adhere to, I'll ask for back and forth and for Emmanuel to actually answer any questions that you might have. So on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, we thank you for honoring our invite and for being here today. And we hope that you'll find this conversation useful and insightful, as we hope it shall be. Thank you very much. So Emmanuel, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kwame. Now, thank you everyone for coming. And I'll begin with an overview of an economic principle that remains true and that we will see is evident even in this particular episode: opportunity cost. Now, because the world's resources are scarce, we must choose between we have to be careful about how we allocate resources, and that's the principle underlying the study of economics. In this particular case, we will be going over the trade in a few products that Kenya exports to the Ukraine and Russia, and that Kenya also imports from these two countries. The other important principle is the principle of comparative advantage. Now, there is two sides to what we try to do here at the IEA. On the one hand, we do have the principles that we propose that trade should be on which policy should be built, and we make observations and say, look, this is one instance that shows why such a perspective is beneficial. Comparative advantages is the idea proposed by David Ricardo, and the principle that the two of us, even if, or let's take countries actually, if two countries are why should two countries actually engage in trade? Well, the idea is that because of the opportunity cost of putting resources in one area or another, and the fact that each country will have conditions that are advantageous to the production of one good over another. Like say, Ukraine is much better than Kenya in producing wheat, then it stands to reason that Kenya should focus on producing one good, the good in which it can specialize, and then the Ukraine can focus on the good that it can specialize. Now I'm going to make sure I keep to time. So I want us to note the three interesting goods that have shown up in the trade profile of Kenya. The profile of the trade between Kenya, Ukraine, and Russia. That is wheat, hot rolled iron bars, which I put up a picture here, and semi-finished iron. Hot rolled iron bars are basically an alloy that it's a semi-processed good, and it's used mainly in infrastructure development. The other good we have here is semi-finished iron. They come in slabs or billets. They are also used. It's also a semi-processed good used in say the reinforcement of concrete. To name one example. What we have before us is the export value of goods from Russia and Kenya. This is the evolution of the value of exports from 1989 to the year 2019. And we can see that Russia is the bigger exporter among the three countries. But notably, actually, Kenyan exports grew 5 times in that period, from 1.91 billion in 1989. Ukrainian exports grew by a factor of 2, from 26 billion, and Russian exports grew by a factor of 3. So we can see that the country that's beginning from a smaller, export value, perhaps owing to the fact that it was starting from a small base, it's grown at a much faster pace. But that, at the very least, we can see that Kenyan exports grew at a higher rate. The next chart I have before us is the evolution of manufacturing sector share of GDP. Now, I thought this was also important to see because I wanted us to get a picture of what goes on economically in these three countries. Now, what we can see is that Kenya is not the strong manufacturer. How can we see that? Well, it's become a principle glean from observation that when you see a country with, say, 10% manufacturing share of GDP, what you expect is that they're not, okay, first of all, that statistic alone tells you that they're not a strong manufacturer. So what you will expect is a relatively underdeveloped or relatively undeveloped manufacturing sector. It's the case with the Ukraine and Russian Federation. The Ukraine, on the one hand, its manufacturing share of GDP has actually plummeted from the 1989. So you can see that the gray line depicting Ukraine shows a precipitous fall. So all this put together is we would expect that Kenya, on the one hand, will trade in less processed goods than the Ukraine and Russia. Now, let's see what exactly these countries trade in. I have before us a chart that depicts Kenya's exports to the Ukraine in the year 2020. And what we can see is that all the goods that are colored in yellow are actually these are foods. Actually, these are food products. Yes, excuse me. These are food products, and yellow and green are all agricultural products. So you have malt extracts and raw tobacco. So more than 80% of Kenya's exports to the Ukraine were made in agrarian products. 41% were made in tea, Kenya's specialty. What can we say about Kenya's trade in tea? Now, the Observatory of Economic Complexity reports that in the year 2020, Kenyan exports to the world were valued at 6.5 billion, and 18% of these exports were made in tea. Well, I wanted to ask myself, well, if Kenya's exports to Ukraine are made in, 40% are made in tea, where else does the Ukraine get its tea from? And we can see here that 33% of Ukrainian tea comes from Sri Lanka, and 20% now, interestingly, came from Russia in the year 2020. What about the global trade in tea? The graph, the chart before us actually shows that Kenya in 2020 took up a 15% share of the global trade in tea. So Kenya is an important player in the global trade in tea. But for the Ukraine, although Kenya did feature as an important, somewhat important trade partner in tea. I mean, its tea export, the value of tea of Kenya's exports in tea to the Ukraine were much smaller than exports from Russia. Now, what could this mean? Well, if we also look at where, I want us to see where Russia got its tea. Sorry, there seems to be a hitch. It's taking a bit of a, yes, there we go. Now we can see that Russia's trade in tea, Russia's imports in tea have a similar composition to Ukraine's imports in tea from the world, that is. We can see that Kenya features as a trade partner in tea for both countries. But while Russia got while the Ukraine had Russia as an important trade partner for its import of tea, Russia did not have Ukraine as a trade partner for imports in tea. So this tells us that Russian tea is going in one direction, but Russia is not known for growing tea, right? So what could be happening? Well, our perspective, our observation is that this could be that Russia is a major importer and processor of tea. So what it does is that it imports tea, packages it, and then sells it to a country like Ukraine. What do Russia and Ukraine have in common? well, they do have something of a shared history, something of a shared culture. So you would expect that using the, say, for example, the gravity model for trade, and culture being one of the drivers for trade, and the fact that the two countries are share a border, but also the fact that Russia's economy is larger. So perhaps the Russians have economies of scale in the processing of tea, and that their ties, their cultural ties to, say, Ukraine and perhaps even the region, place them in a good position to market tea to, say, the Slavic peoples. Now, that's my conjecture. If we go forward to the rest of to Ukrainian exports to Kenya. Well, here I have a chart that depicts Ukrainian exports to Kenya in the year 2020. And then here I have a chart that depicts Ukrainian exports to Kenya in the previous year, the year 2019. Now, what is curious about these two charts is that what we can see is that the value of trade between Russia and Kenya and Ukraine, specifically the value of Ukrainian exports to Kenya, actually grew by about 20 million in 2020, right? So right in the middle of COVID, Ukraine's exports to Kenya actually grew. Not only did they grow, but they also changed significantly in composition. We've heard all the conversations and the commentary around wheat, but what we haven't heard is Ukraine's exports in these metal products, in semi-finished iron and hot rolled iron bars. Now, recall I showed us pictures of these two products as we started the presentation, and you can see that in a year, the share of these two goods, the share of Ukraine's exports to Kenya of these two goods actually increased dramatically, right? We have a 46%, we have a jump of in hot rolled iron bars of less than 5%, right? These two metal products had a 5% share of Ukraine's exports to Kenya in 1 year, and then it grew to more than 50% in the following year. That is curious. If we look again at Russia's exports to Kenya, curiously enough, they also take a similar character, right? We see these metal products barely feature as in the profile of Russia's exports to Kenya. But then when we go on to the year 2020, semi-finished iron and hot rolled iron bars actually increase in their share of exports to Kenya. So we have Russia and Ukraine exporting similar products to Kenya. Put another way, Kenya increased its demand for these products in the span of a year, and in a year when trade was reported, or on the whole, economic activity was somewhat suppressed by COVID. Now, the next question we would have here is, well, where else does Kenya get semi-finished iron? In 2020, the same year that Kenya increased its consumption of these two products, of these metal products, semi-finished iron, Kenya sourced 27% of its semi-finished iron from Russia and 21% from Ukraine. How does this compare with the previous year? Well, in the previous year, Kenya's imports in semi-finished iron from Russia were only 12%. And in that year, Kenya made no imports of the same good from the Ukraine. So if we dial back to the second chart, we looked at the chart depicting manufacturing share of GDP. One thing we could see is that the two countries seem to have seem to specialize, have a similar kind of a specialization in the production of these semi-processed metal products, and that Kenya has found them as viable sources to feed its demand for these products. And we can see that South Africa made up almost 70% of Kenya's imports of that good in 1 year. And then South Africa's share actually dropped to 20% in the following year. Well, who actually imports semi-finished iron? Now, the reason we would ask ourselves this question is to try and get a feel for the global profile of the trade in this product, and to situate Kenya within the global trade of semi-finished iron. Now, Kenya being principally an importer, we want to see who else is importing the same good, the same product. In 2020, Kenya's share of the global trade was 0.8%, right? And you can see on this chart that the countries colored in yellow are the countries of the African continent that imported this product, right? Egypt took 1.76% of that good. It was the most important importer. And who exports this good? Well, Russia took 18% of the exports of semi-finished iron. Now, the question from whoever on the ground, you know, the business persons or the interests, let's say, that imported semi-finished iron would be, okay, where else can we source this iron? We can already see that Kenyan importers was sourcing the semi-finished iron, like at the aggregate level. The country was sourcing a semi-finished iron from a whole range of different suppliers, and here we can see globally who the producers of this good are, and we can see that Russia and Ukraine are some of the most important, actually two of the most important exporters of semi-finished iron. So this somewhat explains why Kenya would find them as a useful source of the product, right? Now we go on to the other metal. We had noticed that in 1 year, Kenya's imports in metals of these two specific kinds, right, the semi-processed metals, that actually increased dramatically. The other product was hot rolled iron bars. What we can see here is that in 2019, 51% of Kenya's imports in hot rolled iron bars came from South Africa. In the following years, 2020, Kenya actually reduced, or the share of South Africa's share of Kenya's imports in hot rolled iron bars actually dropped to 11%, perhaps making room for Russia and Ukraine. Who else imports hot rolled iron bars? We can see here that Kenya actually took up 1.2% of the global import trade in hot rolled iron bars. Now, this is significant because when you consider that Kenya's population and even economic output are both, very small. We have a very small footprint of the global economic output. We are actually consuming an outsized amount of, say, more than our fair share of hot rolled iron bars. And that if we take a closer look at the evolution of this share, we see here in 1 year, this graph depicts, or this picture depicts actually exclusively African countries that imported hot-rolled iron bars. And we can see that in 2019, Kenya imported 7% of Africa's total consumption. 0.06 billion in hot iron bars. The largest consumer on the continent of this product in a year that the rest of the continent actually reduced its consumption, so that the total import value was 850 million. Kenya actually increased its share of the continental aggregate total trade to 15%. So note, that is a jump from 7% to 15%. And we can see here that Kenya becomes now more than just a blip on the radar, right? On the global radar. And you're talking about a country that now is importing just less than half of what the United States imported. Now, we should also note that for many of these countries, like say the United States, they also probably consume a lot of their own domestically produced hot-rolled iron bars. Exporters of the product, mainly Europe and Asia. So Kenya would have a different choice, opportunity, and sorry, excuse me. Oh, okay, just a second. We have a where do you know how far you could hear me, right? Oh no, you're right here. Okay, so is it do you know how far I had or should I just keep going from where I was? Okay, fine. Look, now we think that Kenya's consumption of these semi-processed metals could be largely explained by Kenya's infrastructure binge. Those driving the streets of Nairobi or even roving around Kenya will have noticed all kinds of that it's a lot of construction, right? From lab set projects all the way down to what's depicted in this picture, the Uhuru, the highway running all the way from Kenya's Nairobi's international airport to Westlands. Now, finally, we'll say something about wheat. And the first thing to note about the global trade in wheat is that most wheat producing countries now actually consume most of their wheat. So 70% of the world's total production of wheat is consumed domestically. 30% is traded internationally. So what does that mean? That means that yes, on the one hand, there is if we look at the signs of pressure being applied to these markets, there are signs that there is that global conditions and specifically Russia's invasion of Ukraine are actually placing some pressure on the international trade of the product. And we can see that for example, judging from the price of secondhand farming machine tools in different countries, like say Australia, that farmers there perceive that there will be that they could plug some hole in the demand. This is where Kenya imported its wheat in 2020. This is where it imported its wheat in 2019. And we can see that Ukraine actually became a more important trade partner, or sorry, a less important trade partner in the 2 years, while Russia became a more important source of Kenya's wheat. Finally, let's how is wheat used? It's more well, in terms of consumption, most wheat is actually consumed by animal feeds, right? Although on the one hand, the pressure on wheat and soft commodities in general is actually has not been as high since the 2008 global financial crisis. The consumers, one thing we could say is that consumers will look for different options. There's also evidence that not all commodities are facing the same pressure. So on the one hand, while there's pressure on wheat specifically, rice, on the other hand, isn't experiencing pressure from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. To conclude, show us a very quick chart to just show the general pressure that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is placing on commodities in general. So what we can say is that it is not wheat specifically that will inflict pain on Kenyan households, right, from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but rather it's the whole the general effect on commodities that Russian invasion of Ukraine has had, right? The fact that oil is experiencing upward pressure, the fact that iron, also owing to pre-existing COVID conditions, right? And the fact that China itself is also continuing with its zero COVID policies, right? So here we can see the upward pressure on iron ore. This is a trend running from 2017. If we zoom in on 2022, we can see, okay, excuse me, I think the year is kind of cut off at the bottom, but you can see from February. But the trend in iron ore, it's difficult to attribute it fully to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? There might be other supply chain related matters. Here we have wheat prices and the pressure. You can see February 2022 to March, it's very, very steep spike in wheat prices. So to conclude, what is the character of trade between Kenya and the Ukraine and Kenya and Russia? Well, we can see the principles of comparative advantage and specialization at play. All countries these three countries were benefiting from global trade, even leading right up to the invasion. We can see that Kenyan exports to Ukraine and Russia are similar in composition, and they reflect Kenya's low complexity of exports, right? Kenya is still specializing in agriculture. The differences in value can be in the value of trade between Kenya and Russia and Kenya and Ukraine could perhaps be explained partially by the relative economic size. So Russia being a much, much larger economy. Very quickly, I can give us the Ukraine's per capita GDP in 2020, or rather, sorry, 2019 was $3,726. Neighboring Belarus actually had a double that. Not an extremely wealthy country. Yes, we could see that although the Ukraine, I mean, even as evident, even in its prominent national symbol, the flag, right? The blue representing the sky, the yellow or gold representing the fields of wheat. The fact that I think more than 40% of, or let me say, because the number has escaped my mind, a great share of Ukrainian land is actually used to produce wheat, right? So we can see there the principle of comparative advantage and specialization at play. Why should we look at that? What's the relevance of that point? Well, we've heard many calls for countries like Kenya and other countries in the East African region to specialize in the production of wheat, and that people say things like Kenya shouldn't be dependent on the Ukraine for wheat, or this crisis proves that we are the weakness of inherent in being reliant on someone else for our food. And we would say, well, look around us. We benefit. Some of us will be we're plugged in on our Samsung phones, on our HP or MacBook laptops. We are turning off our Samsung televisions, driving our Japanese Land Cruisers. We are consuming our Swiss Nescafe. So we're benefiting from international uh, of metals. Fertilizer trade, Russia being an important export of fertilizer, and Kenya actually being an important import of Russian fertilizer, actually see some effects, I mean, all the way down from the supply chain itself. The fact that goods like wheat, right? You have produce your wheat, you keep it in storage, and then you put it on a ship and you export it. Report that that Russia is actually trying to obstruct Ukrainian production of wheat, mean that we're going to see increasing pressure on that source of supply. We can see yeah. Now, finally, many of us do remember this story from our child. And now what happened in the story was that the little red wheat, and he went around, or she went around the farm asking the farm animals to please help me, help her at different points of the wheat or bread production value chain. And at each point, she reported that the other farm animals refused to help her. And because they refused to help her, he would not share the bread that she produced in the end. Now, what an economist might say is that I hope the other farm animals refused to help the little red hen, because maybe it evoked the principle of comparative advantage. The opportunity cost of engaging. Maybe the hen was really good at harvesting these wheat products. So look, we should help her. We should let her do what she does and what we're good at. Wasn't the case, then an economist being dropped into that situation. The other. We have more of the other stuff on television.
All right. Thanks a lot. Okay, so taking us through trade structure. Tripartite trade. What does buy for similarities, and obviously some insights arose. One of them including the fact that, look, both countries and Ukraine actually receive a lot of exports import a lot of stuff from Russia, and in the reverse. The other thing that is quite evident is that Kenya's exports to both countries is mostly typical of its income level, but also typical of the fact that most of Kenya's exports of goods tend to be agriculture related. So tea, obviously, coffee, and stuff like that. Imports as well from the two countries of different kinds. Of course, they change between 2019 and 20, but it's typical of the fact that there's less metal, semi-processed metal, which is used in the construction industry, both of construction of infrastructure, but also the construction of homes or buildings generally. And as we can see, that this disruption may have aggravated, and I've seen complaints from other newspapers showing that in the, we call informal sector industry actually complain of the absence of metals that are used in the construction they do. So the backflow of this disruption is very clear, and it's almost immediate. Given that just 6-7 weeks away from the invasion. You also shown the structure. One thing that I liked and has not been around was the fact Kenya in 2020 for wheat full data available, imported close to 1.7% of all imports of which is used in construction. Obviously, that's an interesting one. The conjecture is that part of it was in government, the need for construction of infrastructure, but on the other side, the construction in Kenya has actually been boom, which has created some of the largest sectors in GDP growth over time. And then you talked about the supply chain structures. The things that most of these countries import from each other tend to be very bulky. We're talking iron. We're talking when we're talking about wheat and all that. So grains, cereals coming both from Russia and Ukraine, supplying part of a good quantity of what comes in Kenya, and the shock, which Emmanuel assumes is basically substitutable. Global press, and this just global press talked about the fact that 25%, 35% of the wheat is available exported globally from these two countries, so Russia and Ukraine, that have large stepes or plantations ready for the planting of cereals, and export quite a bit of it. But the data Emmanuel shows also suggests that regardless of the fact that they export a larger part, most cereals, and especially both corn and especially wheat rather, tends to be consumed at home. More than 70% of wheat most countries produce is consumed at home. So the possibility that there be a substitute for Kenya exists. And so there not necessarily be a crunch. It's not as consolidated an industry as we think for petroleum. And then, of course, the petroleum effect with prices going up, partly because of the politics of a conflict, but also part of the fact that the economy and the sanctions that have been applied on Russia, major exporter of petroleum, exporter of petroleum, I think that's going to be current. Kenyans are feeling it. And it's not necessarily because of the conflicts. The conflict has collided with bad policy in Kenya, both in terms of price controls, but also a price control mechanism, and also the mechanism for distribution of fuel, which has gone wrong. So I think we're having the worst of two worlds. I think the composition of global trade tells you something. I think Russia is still a major one. Kenya's exports into Russia, specifically tea, allows for Russia to be a global, or rather a regional redistributor. So basically probably blending, publishing, so blending and distributing perhaps the global, the varieties that are most preferable in Eastern Europe. So obviously not just Kenyan tea, but just basically an importer. So this was also been a lesson about how middle income or countries with a more sophisticated industrial structure in relative terms are able to actually repackage and reprocess tea, which they do not produce, and then redistribute it, including to Ukraine itself and all that. So that's an interesting realization that we have. On the whole, I think it reemphasizes that global connections, yes, in as much as we'd like to. And it's better to trade than to fight, but it looks as if the dependence of all countries on each other are such that none of them could apply diplomatic leverage, especially for Kenya and Ethiopia. I mean, Kenya and Ukraine to avoid this war, and Kenya and Ukraine are on the worst part, the sharp ends. For Ukraine, obviously, it's not just the economic, but also the physical assault that's taking place. But Kenya and Ukraine are on the same side regarding, look, the sooner this ends, the better our global, the ability to process and to actually receive on the basis of comparative advantage, to receive products and goods and the exchange possibilities that have been available to continue. So that's my very basic summary. I'd also like to acknowledge that one of our colleagues, Leo, sent out a link to an opinion article by Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize economist who knows something about both financial services, financial sector, knows something about global conflict and about how economies respond during shocks, who's written something about the fact that, to paraphrase, autocrats may believe that financial exposure to the authoritarian regimes will make democracies afraid to stand up for their values. Maybe so, and that's part of what might be happening now. But on the whole, the opinion article is actually an argument for why war, and of course, you have a few people in Kenya pushing hashtags that I suspect might be sponsored, and they're entitled to their freedom of speech. We must protect that, but actually it's wrong. The idea that imperialism is good economic policy is actually nonsense based on simple specialization and economic thinking. And when you have somebody like Paul Krugman calling it out, it's something that we thought we could share with you to actually look at. And then, of course, the final one, which is the Little Red Hen. I think it's a storybook that people, I don't know, I was not educated during the CBC years, so I'm not too sure that people in CBC read it today. But it's a book that's available. It's a long fable that Emmanuel has actually tried. So maybe, Emmanuel, you should have one other opportunity to talk to us about what the metaphors that you extract, which come from economic reasoning, that the book contains. But that stated, I'd like to open this conversation now to questions and answers. And there are two ways to do that. You can send your questions through the chat box, and Emmanuel will respond to them, or through the reactions, you can simply raise your hand, and then I'll call out to you so that you can we can hear you and have the conversation going. You might have comments, you might have something that you think we forgot, or an insight that is just a reason based on this presentation or what you think we should place on the record. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me have your questions now. Anybody with a question? Anyone? All right. Okay. As you process your questions, I'd like to say this to Emmanuel. Now, Emmanuel, you ran pretty quickly through those trees that tells you what share of what kind of products Kenya exports to Ukraine and Russia, and which ones come back from both Ukraine and Russia. Now, please let us know what you think. The prospects of a protracted war would change the structure of that trade. What does it mean? And then secondly, maybe you can tell us what it means for the region as well. The East African region has been expanding. Do you think there's any chance that the integration within East Africa or the structure of trade within East Africa might be affected by a war that obviously goes on for much longer, a protracted war, as opposed to what all of us cross our fingers and hope happens, a quick resolution to this conflict? Emmanuel?
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Kwame. Thank you for the question. I think if we take it commodity by commodity or good by good, starting off with wheat, if the war continues and extends, if we see an extension of the conflict, right, of the invasion, one thing we can see for wheat is that on the ground itself, there have been reports of deliberate attacks on both wheat storage facilities and sometimes even the farms themselves, and reports of farmers, actually Ukrainian farmers, farming and arming their tractors as they farm. We've also, so on the one hand, you have farmers who are determined, of course, to get their product out. We also have seen that the ports, the main Ukrainian ports around Mariupol and even Crimea, which was taken before, are being blockaded and being deliberately attacked by Russia. So this bodes ill for Ukraine's exports in wheat. Of course, Ukrainian farmers are also looking after their livelihood, and this will be unfortunate for their own incomes. For the global market and specifically for regional consumers of wheat, they will be pressed to look for other sources of wheat. So other countries will try to step up to plug in the demand. We can already see that. Okay, what would we use? Maybe I would ask myself, how would I judge what other players think about the market, or how they would respond? So first of all, starting with how they would respond, if the farmer believes that the conflict is going to be prolonged, whether he's in Australia or Argentina, and number two, if he thinks that he still has more arable land, that he can still produce more, then he will try to plug in that hole. And then adding to that the fact that most global wheat is actually consumed domestically. If there is capacity to expand, farmers will try to expand and reap the benefits of, say, a rising price in wheat. Consumers in Kenya will feel the pressure at the household level of rising prices of wheat, depending on how much of it they consume. They'll probably look to diversify away. As for the region, we can see that there's demand for trade, first of all, right? With the Congo's entry into the East African community is evidence that there's a perception that trade is good and that being part of a trading community is good. What pressure could the region face? Well, from the conflict itself, the region will feel the inflationary pressure of rising prices, right? Because important commodities like oil, like crude oil, are actually helping to drive up the prices of other commodities, because we have, even at the very basic level, transportation costs. Already, the East African community, it's very, very costly. You know, there's a World Bank report that shows that the region, transport in the region is among, it costs, the costs are among the highest in the world. You know, you measure the cost in terms of the kilometers, per kilometer traveled, you know, how much fuel you have to pay, and fuel being just a small component of that. You also have the cost of, say, paying your drivers, and even the cost of checkpoints. So all this put together means that the region is going to feel the inflationary pressure, and that would have the character that's specific to the region will have to do with the cost of transportation primarily. So that's a matter of the supply chain pressures. Yeah, so I mean in some, supply chain pressure to commodities, those two will cost the region dearly if the war is prolonged.
All right. Okay. Now we have a couple of 3 questions, so let me read them out. The first is basically by Wafula Nabutola here. He asks, what advantage did we as an economy obtain by discontinuing the import substitution policy? By import substitution, I think you mean, I mean, Emmanuel understands it, right? But it's basically the clamor for self-reliance, which is import substitution. So you make imports difficult, and you domestic production. So I think Emmanuel knows that. He spoke to us about opportunity cost, but maybe you answer that, Emmanuel. The second is from Tumbo Alice, and Alice asks, first she commends us for Emmanuel for such an informative presentation. I would like to know how we should cushion ourselves in the future, given the current exposure or vulnerability as a region, say Africa at large. Is it time that we focus on being self-sufficient? More or less the same question. Emmanuel, you can go for that as well. And then Mr. Nanjong, I assume, thanks for a most illuminative lecture, Emmanuel. with the onset of COVID having disrupted economic activities globally in 2020, and Kenya, Ukraine, and Russia included, how useful is data gathered in 2020 for comparative purposes as used in the lecture? I think that's a pertinent question as well about how trade data, but trade data tends to be historical, but still, Emmanuel, you can answer that. And finally, we have Minor Morris, and he says, what do you make of President Zelensky's request to speak to the African Union? Will Africa and Kenya now at the United Nations Security Council be called upon to play a bigger role in efforts to stop prolonged conflict? If yes, what would this look like? Okay, fine. So Emmanuel, please go ahead with those questions.
Thank you, Kwame. I find these are very, very good questions. Thank you for asking them. I'll go backwards and start with Minor Morris Njogu. I think that actually President Zelensky's request to speak at the AU, maybe, I'm very happy to see it coming at this time. Now, I think it's good that he recognizes the value of international support wherever it comes from. And I would add that on the AU side and on the side of African states, that African states have been too silent, I think, and too maybe pussyfooting around the issue. Why would I say that? Because if African states started at their very basic interest and their duty to protect, and to serve African citizens, then they could have been there at the onset looking for ways to make sure that African citizens can leave Ukraine safely. And they should have been there to kind of emphasize and look, say, Zelensky, we see some of the reports on the ground from what's happening to African students, and we understand it. But look, if you help us to get a better, to improve the reality on the ground for these students, you could actually give us the political cachet to now go back and tell our citizens that it would work in Zelensky's favor in terms of trying to curry some support, right? But I think I should conclude that by saying that responsibility is important, and it's important to press that African states at least take responsibility for the livelihood of their own citizens. And secondly, I would say that putting this within the context of democracy. The African continent has very, very recent experience with the value of democracy. We know what autocracy does for us. That what I would make of Zelensky's request is that for those of us pressing our governments and stakeholders of our states, we should see this as an opportunity to further democracy, to further the rights of the weakest, say, of the least among us. Let me move on to the question about statistics. Now, I think it's a very good question because a lot of what we have to go on is sometimes snapshots of what we can see on the ground. For example, the reports I made about Ukrainian farmers and the hardship they're experiencing, and the reports about the prices of farming tools, farming machine tools. So what would I say in this case? You use this data to kind of tell you where you're coming from, right? And then we use other proxies that tell us about where we are and where we might be headed to. So I don't think economists are here to kind of predict the future. We're not necessarily prophets of the future, but there are things that we say that are relevant. And actually, this dovetails to Alice's question about vulnerability and exposure, because I think she's kind of speaking to, it's not only embarrassing but painful to be caught with swimming naked when the tide recedes, right? It's both embarrassing, but also it can be in the case of shifting economic winds, it's felt at the household level. In terms of people go hungry, poverty rates rise. So what we would say is countries that have a small narrow corridor for economic growth and development should be especially keen not to make wrong-headed, ill-informed policy decisions. So, although economists don't prophesy, there are instances where certain principles apply, and we can see, look, don't consume so much debt. It's going to cost us in the future. And don't consume so much low quality debt. This is going, not only is it going to cost us in the future, it's going to cost us in terms of the opportunities, right? 3 billion wasted in SGR, a project that can't even repay itself, that the taxpayer has to pay out of his own money. Predictable, right? So my answer there is that although data can be dated, right? There are questions around using old data to speak on the current times. We can fill in the gaps of data with principles and basic observations of the environment to say with some degree of certainty what is prudent to do and what isn't. What advantage did we as an economy obtain by discontinuing the import substitution policy? Look, I think the advantages are all around us in terms of if you enjoy your smartphone, advantage. Sorry, hello. Could you please mute your mic? Or did you want to ask a question? Okay, let me just finish, and then you could ask your question, and you could also type it. So I will come right there. I'm gonna finish. So the basic advantages. Look, this is a question that's also come up in a different form during COVID. Why are we not producing our own vaccines? And if you take a picture of the typical hospital ward, right? You have the bed, you have your ECGs and all these machines. Look, even in the United States, right? You will have bed sheets or bed covers coming from Europe or Asia. You will have IV machines and needles coming from India. We'll have ECGs coming from Europe. And so these are the advantages that economies obtain, and not just ours, even South Korea, from discontinuing import substitution policies. I think I'll close this question by saying that even in Korea's case, actually import substitution was largely replaced by export promotion, and it was not as wide-ranging as many believe. You know, South Korea was not an autarkic country, because I think that's where this type of question comes from. So let's see. I see another question says, post-war, Russia insists on having its exports paid by ruble in the event that they succeed in this pursuit. What implication will this have on the Kenyan shilling, if any? Let's see. If Russia insisted that Kenya should pay for its Russian imports in ruble, well, since the dollar and the euro and other of those hard currencies offer consumers a wider choice, well, it's likely that one decision consumers make is to just look for those goods elsewhere and to forfeit having to trade in the ruble, because a ruble restricts your choice. No one else wants a ruble. So that's one response that people would have. Because as far as saying what implication this has on the shilling, maybe I'll leave to someone else to answer. Perhaps I'll invite Kwame to answer that. But I would say that consumers, right, the consumers who are trading with Russia, it's possible that they just look for the goods elsewhere, and they look for markets that accept the dollar so that they can maintain their own freedom of consumption. What is the official status of Kenya with respect to exporting to Russia? What is the Kenyan government doing to open direct freight routes to Russia for cut flowers? Oh, this is a good question. I wonder if someone, maybe I'll invite Kwame to also answer that, because I'm currently not aware what the official status of Kenya is with respect to exporting to Russia, but I've not heard of any official, say, restriction, for example. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. All right. Thanks, Emmanuel. Let me try. So I have two questions for which I haven't been asked, but I'll try and interpose my comments as moderator. I think the first thing is an import substitution, as you said it. So the costs we pay for the gains we've had from import substitution is that we are able to sell tea to Russia and buy wheat from them. So import substitution would mean that we'd have to grow our own wheat. So I wonder who would buy Kenya's coffee and who would buy Kenya's tea. So look, the import substitution policy was tried for a whole generation in Kenya. It wasn't abandoned because of a fad. It was abandoned because it just didn't work efficiently enough. So that's basically it. Secondly, if you look at the characteristics of countries that grow lots of cereals, for instance, and why Kenya imports cereals from Russia or any other part of the world, is they tend to be countries that have huge land, that's one, and two, have lots of water, because cereals take a lot of water. And you know, with the maize harvest, so like this year's maize harvest is probably going to be substantially cut down because the rains have been late. Kenya doesn't have all those qualities in place. Kenya's arable land structure is actually just less than 15%, actually 12%, and perhaps shrinking because of poor land use. So that's it. Now, the reason people trade is on the basis of your specialization, and your specialization is the concept from which comparative advantage arises. So it's a question that I think is a good one, but it is not possible for Kenya to produce everything of its own. And as Emmanuel said, our phones are actually the benefits of transferring from import substitution to comparative advantage. Coming to what Isaac asked the question about payment in ruble. Most of these trade arrangements tend to be on the basis of contracts, and what the contracts say is what happens. So now Russia does not insist yet that Kenya pays in ruble. What Russia is trying to do is to insist for countries that are trying to sanction it, that the banks from those countries should pay, say, for Russian oil and all that in ruble. And the reason for that is to actually support the exchange rate by making sure the currency, by making sure that it remains at least strong. So what would happen if Russia insisted that Kenya should buy stuff in ruble? Perhaps Kenya could also insist that Kenyan tea be bought in shillings, and you know how that would collapse very, very quickly. So often people go for currencies that are available more roundly globally. So yes, somebody would actually still insist on ruble, but as Emmanuel has showed, it probably would make some trade very, very awkward and perhaps impossible. And where alternatives exist, and if Kenya has a bigger market for and access to dollars, then obviously that could lead to a shifting of trade over time. I'm not too sure that it would do anything to the Kenya shilling immediately, because the shilling and the ruble trade is not strong. It's not a very big market so far. Coming to Disha's questions, you ask about what is the Kenyan government doing to open direct flight routes to Russia for Kafla. I'm not too sure, to be honest, but I would say two things that I know. The reason Kenyan flowers go first to Amsterdam and London directly is because they have huge volumes and the markets are available. I'm not too sure that Kenya has direct access of Kenyan airlines into Moscow, for instance, and then cargo would actually follow. So if the volumes are not sufficient, perhaps it makes sense for Kenyan flowers, on the basis of the economic sense, for the Kenyan flowers to be landed in Amsterdam and then to be taken by road or by any other means up there, because of the networking effect, but also the function of volumes, making it easier to transport quantities and then to redistribute them. That's how global trade works. So the value chains are, on the one side, a product, and it needs a service to be delivered. So maybe the most efficient service is to deliver it in Amsterdam and then to transfer it to the rest of Europe, both the east, north, and of course, the western part of Europe. Yes, and then you say the key reason flowers are not transported by air freight is that there are challenges in clearing cut flowers at Moscow airport. Kenya phytosanitary certificates are not recognized, and it is also expensive. So you stated it. So part of that is, yes, if they are, then obviously it would not make sense for a business person. But if they go through Amsterdam and it is cleared through Amsterdam, then obviously that's part of the trade. So in other words, Kenya is not just trading flowers into Amsterdam or into Europe, but actually also benefiting from the services that are added, which are the services for the assessment to ensure that they are safe enough to go to Moscow and Russia. And so in this case, in Russia, phytosanitary standards are actually a non-trade barrier that restricts Kenyan trade into Russia. And obviously, the collapsing of those would be more useful for everybody then, because if those volumes existed, then there'd be direct flights into Europe for that. I'll mention there's a question about, I think it's from, is it Isaac Aleha, and he asks, Emmanuel responded to it, but let me just give it a spin. Post-war, Russia insists on having its export. Sorry, it wasn't that. It was by Maina. What you say is, what do you make of President Zelensky's request to speak to the African Union? Will Africa and Kenya now at United Nations Security Council member be called upon to play a bigger role in efforts to stop prolonged war? I think if you speak about the AU, for instance, one of the things that the AU has done decently is actually to try and stop conflicts within the continent. And if that diplomacy can be exported to other parts of the world, of course, Africa is not necessarily the best example, but it is. But we must also be conscious that different African countries, based on what they consider their national interest and sovereign interest, took different views at the United Nations Security Council, but also at the United Nations General Assembly when all these things came in. And they're perfectly entitled to it. In as much as, of course, we are showing that the general dependence by some African countries on imported cereals has actually had an adverse effect. So obviously those countries would have an interest, a commercial one, outside the humanitarian one, for these conflicts to end quickly. So President Zelensky has a right, he's requested. I think the African Union should listen to him. Maybe he'll persuade some few people. He's done marvelously trying to defend the interest of his country. I know some African people have hang-ups with Ukrainian exports of military equipment, which has been used in some words in some parts of this continent. Be that as it may, I think he's owed an opportunity to be listened to, and then African countries can decide for themselves. I think as well that we should not overplay the question about Africa. I prefer that every country takes its own decisions. Kenya made a bold decision at the United Nations Security Council, at the United Nations General Assembly, decided to refrain from a vote. All those communicating political stances, and I suspect that was very deliberate. So let's assume that every country knows what it does. I do not think, and I think this opportunity tells us that sometimes we overplay the question about an African interest. Every African country of the 55 of them, 54, 55 of them, has an interest, and to the extent that it has its own sovereignty, should be allowed to play. When we have interests that actually converge at the African Union as well, then maybe those can also be coordinated at that level. Yes, I hope that answers those questions. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think there are any other questions. Unless somebody else had, I saw a hand up, sorry. I saw a hand up. Whose hand was up? I saw a reaction, somebody's hand was up. My apologies, I was waiting to answer the questions first. So maybe you can have your hand up again, and then I'll allow you to ask your question. Yes, let me see, whose hand was it? I can't see it here. Oh, yes, Tulezi. Please switch on your microphone and your camera, and you can ask your question. Go ahead, Tulezi.
Sorry, it was not a question. I just wanted to add to what your answer about our exports of cut flowers to Russia. Yeah, I'm the CEO of Kenya Flower Council. So we deal with cut flowers exports every day, supporting the growers and exporters from Kenya. Yes, Russia is a growing market. In 2021, our sales was about 8.2 billion Kenya shillings into Russia. But we are facing challenges with logistics into the Russian market, so we are not able to do direct into the Russian market. The reason why, as you said, the reason why we do Amsterdam, then track all the way to Moscow. Moscow flowers into Russia cannot be cleared because of phytosanitary certification that is not recognized, but also because the systems cannot be able to handle the kind of volumes that we would rather export into Russia. It's better cleared in Amsterdam, and then from there trucked all the way to Moscow. We've been having discussions with the Russian embassy here to see if there are possibilities of doing direct with a flight from Nairobi direct into Russia. But that, of course, means that on the clearing side, in Russia, then they should be able to be up to the task. When the flowers get there, they can be quickly cleared, and phytosanitary checks can be done as quickly as possible. But also the fact that KEFIS needs to establish a direct agreement with the Russian NPPO so that we can be able to move this directly into Russia. So at the moment, we cannot do that. And we have a number of exporters in Kenya who are basically supplying to the Russian market. A lot of contracts, and some of them have already shared with me, a lot of contracts have been cancelled in the last 2 months. So if you look at basically the volumes that we do into the Russian market, in a year, it's close to about 22,000 tons. And that is sizable if comparing that logistics is an issue. So if we were able to streamline that, it's possible that we can double that. And the promotions that we are doing there with the with the Moscow show that was supposed to happen in October, probably would have helped us to move these volumes up quite a bit. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So there needs to be bilateral going on between Kenya and Russia to surmount some of these challenges. One on phytosanitary, and secondly on logistics and clearing for us to do anything direct. At the moment, there are no discussion, I can tell you. We've been inquiring from the government of Kenya if there is any discussion and how we can be able to plug in, even amidst the challenge that we have with a swift and movement. But virtually there is nothing, no discussion at the moment. So that is a closed market at the moment. We wait to see what happens as we go along. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Lazy, for the clarifying a few things. Yes, and obviously thanks. As you say, it's insightful what you've said, because first it's telling us that yes, there's bilateral action that needs to be done around the question of standards, setting standards and allowing for the inspection to take place efficiently, because obviously we know that flowers are very fragile and highly valuable, but very fragile. So yes, if it doesn't get cleared quickly, then obviously that's a problem. And the second one is just a question of logistics and supply chain management, and obviously wars and invasions don't make it better, but on the whole, of course, there also exists this supply chain which adds value to the entire process itself. So thanks a lot. I hope the government of Kenya takes this up, and that's part of the reason why there are so many people, actually, Kenyans and everybody else, who are crossing our fingers that this does not go beyond what it is, because if already contracts are being cancelled, that's not good, and it obviously is another effect on Kenya in terms of employment and obviously value being back here. So thanks a lot. So I saw Emmanuel say that Abhi, is it Abhi Patel? Do you have a question? You could answer. You could ask your question, please. We still have some time. Please put on your microphone and then, switch on your microphone and then you can ask the question. Abhi Patel, did you have a question? Okay, seems like he can't hear me. All right. Okay, any one person? We have a couple more minutes, about 10 more minutes to go. Right. Okay, thanks a lot. So I'll ask Emmanuel to make any final comments and then we can close on time. Emmanuel, please.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for attending this presentation and for the very good questions, insightful questions, and the kind comments. I think in conclusion, we can see if you take your eyes. In conclusion, I would like to say two things about the benefits of trade and the value of integration, right? So in East Africa, we have an ongoing integration project, and we can see that there is serious demand for it. That's the East African community, right? The fact that Congo, one of the largest countries on the continent, a very highly populated country, very new democratic project, experiment, situated right in the heart of the continent. And they had a choice. I mean, you could reasonably say that they had a choice whether to go south, to go west, or to go east, and perhaps even north. And they chose to go east. I mean, you could even say that they could try and put together their own project. But the fact that they shopped around and they had all kinds of choices and they chose the East African community shows two things. The first is demand for trade, for integration in general, as a guiding principle for cross-border policy making, and also specifically a demand for the East African Community Project in particular, right? We can also see that it's very easy to leave the community, but we can see that Tanzania has stayed on, and Somalia and Sudan proper, Ethiopia are also all waiting in the wings to join. So on the ground, there is a demand for trade. Now, what can we see from the benefits of trade? If we take our eyes and if we lift off of East Africa and fly to Europe, you could see that Ukraine, if you compare Ukraine with some of its neighbors, say the Czech Republic, for example, which I believe it shares a border, and if not, they're very close. Even though they have a shared history as part of the former Soviet socialist republics, right? The Czech Republic has reaped the benefits of being integrated with Europe, right, in terms of economic growth and even growth and development, even as seen in terms of complexity. So Czech Republic actually exports more complex goods now than they did before. We see the same with Poland. Poland, by joining the European Union, actually is one of the most significant success stories, economic success stories of the late 20th and this 21st century, by doing among many things, liberalizing their economy, integrating with Europe. I mean, also the very brave reforms that they made to their state bureaucracy, right, making it smaller. And actually a subject that we might explore more together with Kwame and my colleagues here at the IEA, and try to explain that, look, there are benefits to trade. So when you have a conflict like this that serves to warp, constrain, and really put a strain to, first of all, the global supply chains, and then even production and consumption itself, that it makes it painful for households here at home, painful for households elsewhere abroad. And it just highlights how easy it is to wipe away some of the benefits of trade. So I would say that trade is good, specialization is good. There is an opportunity cost to everything that we do, and that all the animals in the farm, the little red hen, should allow them to do what they're good at. Maybe, okay, I see that they were sleeping. They should wake up and do something, right? But the hen shouldn't be autarkic. Yes, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
All right. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us 1.5 hours here. Now, we hope that we've, in this discussion, shown that there are many more complexities to this question. Overall, our view was actually to re-emphasize the centrality of trade, exchange, and specialization to economic growth and the place of economies. We can see that regardless of its income level and regardless of whatever political interests that exist, I think the conflict and the invasion of Ukraine has effects and unintended consequences both in the country itself and also to others in other parts of the world. It's already showing up in prices of commodities, in prices in Europe, of course, in Kenya and other parts of the world. So it's showing that there's a level, even with that level of integration, there are those costs. Emphasizing the fact that I think peace is a global good for everybody else. And we at the IEA are unequivocal that there's a preference for open trade and free trade relative to the use of other forms of coercion to achieve, whether it's political goals and economic goals. They're illegitimate. The use of force is illegitimate at all times. And we unequivocally would say that we hope that this conflict is resolved, Ukraine regains its sovereignty. But that wasn't our question of the debate today. It was just to show that there is a connection and that in Kenya as well, there are very, very direct and unconnected, direct and obviously hidden and unintended consequences of the conflict that we have, and hope that not only for the purposes of reinforcing trade, because trade only works if people are alive, that it is in the interest of everybody for this conflict to be resolved. First, to reduce the suffering of the people of Ukraine, the people of Russia as well, obviously, and obviously to other Kenyans and African people and everybody throughout the world. But Emmanuel has helped us to understand that, yes, the principle of comparative advantage and specialization does exist. Opening up and the ability to access goods and services at the most competitive prices is only possible if there's less conflict. And our view is that the next time we sit back here to discuss Ukraine, Russia, and Kenya, that we'll be doing that in far happier circumstances. But in the meantime, whether it's by prayer or whether by political action or by conversations, we think that this war should end as quickly as is possible so that the people of Ukraine can continue to build their country and we in Kenya can continue with the trade, opening up opportunities for both Kenya, Russia, and everybody. I think peace is an area in which all of us win, and it's something that we should emphasize without equivocation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. The IEA is a membership organization. If you wish to be a member, please send us an email, and somebody will get in touch with you. We'll have another public forum like this in a couple of weeks. We'll alert you to that in a while as well. And yes, based on a conversation, I think a question that I see in the chat box, we'll edit. And the conversation that has been had today will be made available in a video clip, which will be sent out to you. It will be made available on our website. The recording will be made available on our website, and all of us would have access to it. So on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, our staff, and thanking my colleague Emmanuel, who spent quite some time to make sure that this conversation will take place, bringing some data to us. We are thankful for all the comments that you've given us, and they help us to form far better ideas about what this conflict means, but also what the situation and trade has been. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and we hope to see you again soon. Mm-hmm.